So that's me. That's how you can get a hold of me. So for the most part, dependency injection consists of three primary parts in Angular 2. You've got the injectors themselves, you've got bindings, and you've got the instances they create. So let's take a look at how these all fit together. But first, let's actually talk a little bit about some of the history here. Angular 2 was largely motivated, the creation for it was motivated because of this new dependency injection system. They actually was one of the first pieces that they created and said, hey, let's run with this and see where it goes. It was a complete overhaul from the ground up from what you're using now in Angular 1. And right now it's actually the most mature and polished piece of Angular 2. So polished, in fact, that there's examples of people who are taking just the core DI system out of Angular 2 and putting it in other things. Like Tero Parvainen has an example where he talks about his experience integrating it with Backbone. So it's definitely a really interesting system to take a look at outside of the context of an Angular application as well. So let's talk about injectors. So whenever you bootstrap your Angular 2 application, you can actually specify that, hey, I've got some bindings to some dependencies that I need. And whenever you run across that, that's when Angular is creating for you a root injector. So at that point it's saying, here's a list of things that you can inject anywhere in your application. So it's pretty straightforward. This my service is written somewhere as a class in your Angular application. And then below that layer of the initial application initialization with Bootstrap, you can have any child component or any component of your application then go on to create subsequent injectors that inherit from that root injector or wherever they happen to be in the component hierarchy. And those instances are called child injectors. So if we look at bindings now, if we look, this is pretty much the exact same code here. Back on the injectors, this isn't actually what creates an injector. Angular automatically creates an injector every time you create a component. These, what we're seeing, are actually bindings. These are what instruct those injectors and how to behave. So here we're saying, I want you to go ahead and inject my service and make it injectable from the root level. And this is saying, on this component, somewhere in my application, I want you to go ahead and make my service 2 injectable from that child injector. So this is actually a highly sugared niceness. There's all kinds of additional pieces of functionality that you can use to give more information like, actually I want you to make my service 2 injectable at this layer under some other name, or I want you to go ahead and give it to me in some other way. So this is actually a highly sugared, nice version of it. And we'll see a little bit more about how these pieces fit together here in just a second. So you've got the injectors, which perform the injection. You've got the bindings, which tell it how. And then lastly, you end up with the actual instances that the injector creates. So before we had the bindings up here, and we had those instructing injectors. That's actually not until this line right here that we actually perform an injection. It's actually having it in the constructor and that constructor function being run that actually goes out and injects an instance of a class. So here it's saying, I want you to inject my service. However, the most recent binding injector knows how to give it to me. So let's see a little bit more code, a little bit bigger examples. So here we're going to start with a parent component. Pretty straightforward. Here's our parent component. Here's how you reference that in the HTML. And here's our bindings. We're saying that this parent component wants to inform its injector that it needs to be able to inject my util service. And here we're requesting an instance of it. Pretty straightforward. So let's add another piece. Down here, we still have our parent component doing the same thing it did before, but now it actually has a child component present. And that's defined up at the top. So in our child component, if you look inside our component annotation, we don't have a bindings property. Yet, at the constructor, we're still requesting an injection of my util service. And the way the dependency injection system works is that it does in fact have its own injector. It has a child injector that was inherited from the parent injector, which in turn was inherited from the root injector. But because we didn't specify a binding, that means that it will climb the injector hierarchy looking for the first binding to myutil service. As a result, it's going to get the exact same copy of myutil service that was injected into the parent. So because we didn't specify a binding, we've not given that injector any new instructions on how to go about creating that. So it used the exact same copy on the parent. So let's say that the parent component manipulates the state of myutil service in some way that makes it just not really an option for use in a child component. Well, to achieve that, a new instance is going to be needed. We don't actually want that. So here I've commented out child 1 component. We still have our parent just the same as before, but now we've got a sibling to child 1 called child 2 who does exactly that. By specifying the exact same binding on child component 2, we've now overwritten the instructions for how to go about injecting myutil service. So now these actually refer to 2 different instances of myutil service. Pretty simple. So let's say that we want child component 2 to have its unique copy. But let's say there's a child under child component 2. Let's say it has a grandchild that wants to use the original copy. How do we get back to that state? Well, you might try something like this at first. You've got child component 2, parents commented out, we've got the grandchild. So the only thing that you could possibly try is maybe if I do another binding, that might get it back in sync with what was up above it. And no, that just creates yet another instance further down. So instead, what you need to do is use the view bindings property on child 2. So before we were using bindings, and this is using view bindings. So view bindings actually takes this and says, okay, for this injector, here are some things that you can inject, but I want you to make them available to only the component that this is sitting on. Remove it from that hierarchy that I referred to earlier. So that way, if you have a grandchild who makes a reference to myutil service, because it didn't have a binding specified, it climbs the tree, but because this is on view bindings, it doesn't see this. And it proceeds up the hierarchy until it gets back to the parent. Seeing a little bit of skeptical faces there. Is that making sense?
Well, do you have any sense of why it works the way it does?
Why it works the way, what part of it so far? Why it creates that hierarchy, or?
Yeah, like is there anything out there that would tell us, like, why this is believed to be a really good way for this to work? Like the word view bindings, you said does that mean it's only for the view, or does that mean it's only for this component?
It's only for that component. It's the actual property name here is like the least settled on part of the Angular 2 syntax. Like the how DI works itself is pretty solid, but that particular, like, do you use view bindings, there was some other properties that have phased out now. So the naming there is still kind of a little wishy-washy.
Is the intent there that, like, this is going to be some sort of encapsulated component, kind of like an isolate scope in an Angular 1 directive, or is it, and I don't mean this is the same as scope, I mean, like, this needs to be self-contained, don't make it part of the inheritance hierarchy so that it doesn't, like, disturb anything else?
That's the only way I've seen view bindings explained, is in the context of removing it from the hierarchy of injected components. Right,
so
yes.
means just for me.
Right.
Binding means for me and anybody inside me.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Like there's possibly and probably some other reasoning behind that, but this is the only explanation I've seen given for view binding so far. This kind of usage of, let's pop this out of the tree and let anyone below me just get a parent instance of it if they need to. And I've also seen, generally speaking, that people will actually use view bindings where possible. I don't know if this is a best practice or just something that's kind of bubbling to the top out of what people have been seeing in examples, but more often than not, I've seen people use view bindings when they can. And that sounds like it might be a good practice off the top of my head. I'm not positive on that though. So you were also asking about. Oh, there's a second part that I wanted to address. Your original question about why it works this way.
Yeah, like any sense of like the rationale behind the design.
Yeah, so if you actually go check out, there's a couple. If you just Google for Angular 2 dependency injection, it's like one of 4 actual articles that you can actually find.
Just read stuff.
Yeah, the actual core DI system is really slick in terms of its flexibility. And there's a post from Victor, I can't remember his last name at the moment. Savkin, yes, Victor Savkin, explaining the problems with Angular dependency injection in Angular 1 and how this just knocks all of those straight out. It does a great job of explaining that and going through kind of their motivation for why this is a better approach. And then ThoughtRam also has one that outlines even more of that. And it just does a pretty good job of just hitting all the finer points. It's got a lot of flexibility. What we're seeing here is the very much sugared, like this looks absolutely nothing like if you're actually using their injector system, it looks nothing like it. So this is just like the thinnest layer of, like, I only want to know enough to be able to make my application work version of it. You can actually just use that injector standalone to, fire off individual injectors all over the place, create various layers of injectors in your own class hierarchy, and it's got tons of flexibility behind it. And that's kind of where the majority of the support is, like around that, the full picture of it, rather than just the snippet that we're using here. So to wrap up the code bit that we were talking about, so this is in the end kind of the picture of what we created. We created a parent component, child 1, child 2, and grandchild. Each of these actually requested an injection of my utils, but depending upon how you injected it, but depending upon how it was requested, actually determines which instance you're getting. Because we specified view bindings on child 2 that not only overrode what was in the parent, but also removed it from the view of grandchild, who requested it and found its copy on parent. So that is all I have. Any questions?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
We can do some questions.
Yeah?
Early on, you were talking about these multiple different levels, and it's only at the point where you do something that the injection actually occurs.
Right.
In Angular 1, if you define, say, a factory, but don't ever actually use a controller where that factory happens to be injected, that factory never gets instantiated.
Right.
What's the equivalent here? So at what point do we really get my utils service code running?
So I don't know if, so here's my parent, this is the highest point in the hierarchy in this example where we have my util service specified. I don't know if it's at the creation of the injector for this level, with it noticing that it's in that bindings, that if it actually creates it and holds it available there, or if it actually delays loading that until it actually sees a request for it in the constructor. But I know this is the piece that when you're referring to it is injected, this is actually the injection portion of that term, and this is the binding for that. As far as which one of these signifies, okay, go ahead and fire up the new instance. Yeah, I'm not sure where in the timing it does that yet. Yeah.
Is this TypeScript code?
Yeah, this is all TypeScript.
But is there a way to get that same capability if you like ES 2015 or plain JavaScript better?
Yeah, there's
Because you wouldn't have the type name there to figure out what to inject. There has to be some other way.
right. There's a mechanism, and this is a couple months old now, which is as good as completely antiquated in this space. But last I looked, there was a way to, after you have your object defined for your parent component, you could then go ahead and put some additional properties on there and say, okay, here's my actual list of bindings. I essentially do what annotation does for you, which is augment the object with additional properties. Yeah.
Oh, I have a list.
Oh, fire away.
In Angular 1, we got really good at telling people all services are singletons.
Mhm.
End of story. No matter what you read on Stack Overflow, all services are single instance.
Right.
There's either 0 or 1 of them in
Yep.
the application. What's the story here?
It, that the responsibility is now on the consumer. If you want it to be a singleton, it can be a singleton. If you override it, you create a new instance.
Right.
Totally up to the user, and that's one of the big points.
Does any of this depend on the old crazy, like, we're gonna parse the source code for the parameter list for dependency injection, or is it like a grown-up way of doing this now?
There,
B.
I don't think it's doing that anymore, but I wouldn't be surprised to find out somewhere because of
Some new
JavaScript
level
craziness.
of crazy magic.
Yeah, because now you got TypeScript on top of it, so there, who knows what, I don't know for sure. I haven't seen it anywhere, because really, I mean, everything that we've listed here is actually a reference to a thing.
Right.
So it's, right. So at least at the TypeScript level, I've not seen that. I know in the ES5 though, you actually do use strings in there occasionally. So I'm thinking that this might possibly compile down into something that then turns around and has to use that string parsing thing, but I don't think so.
Last one.
Yep.
Another issue with Angular 1 dependency injection is around like the lack of namespacing. So if you have a customer module with a utils service inside of it,
Mhm.
and a products module with a utils service inside of it, and you ask for the utils
Mhm.
service to be injected, well, I mean, there's a way of knowing which one you're going to get, but it's hard to get to the other one.
Right.
It looks like all that's handled here. How is that handled?
So that's all handled by the fact that's just TypeScript. TypeScript in the module loader system. Off screen here above this, you'd have your import myutil service from module A, or import myutil service from module B, or something else entirely. You can import both of them and alias them to different names.
Do you have the ability at some like much lower level than that? It's like, no, I explicitly want like a fully qualified class name or something that you can say, I want the one from the customer module subsection B utils. Or do you have to do that somewhere else and give it like a unique alias throughout the application?
Yeah, that's all part of the same module system. Like your modules, can have submodules and so on and so forth. And you wouldn't utilize that right here, but that's totally based on how you choose to import it.
So it's the fact that we've got a real module system now, we can just depend on it.
Yeah.
We can just use it.
Yeah.